doubt that the effects of our late-stage capitalist society seeps into and influences the media that we consume. It's this very neoliberalist model that has turned many writing adages from write what you know to write what your audience wants. For if you're creating under the means of profit, it is important to know your fan base so you can market to them in order for your product, whether it be a book, show, or film, to be successful. Now, this is a simplistic idea that does not take much scrutiny to understand, and explains why we have critical theory discussions around topics that emerge from a capitalist lens, such as concepts like the male gaze, which is the sexualization of women in media in order to appeal to male audiences. It's a simple concept that does not require a lot of logical steps for one to see how this can incentivize profits. However, there also exist more covert marketing techniques that try to appeal to more niche audiences. Enter the world of queerbaiting and the pink dollar. Queer media, in its purest form, is a rejection of all things normative, capitalist, and universal. Thus, queerbaiting, or the act of playing up non-canonical homoeroticism, that is done so as a marketing strategy is anything but queer. Yet, we still see it used, however, and most of the time it comes at the expense of the fetishization of sexuality. Now, in Western media, we can see this most commonly in the fetishization of lesbian relationships for straight men. Oftentimes, this girl-on-girl fan service that has worked into a lot of masculine narratives is there for the sole reason of titillating male audiences. But as I said before, the broad male audience is not the only group that can be marketed to. Thus, in Eastern Japanese media, we have the prevalence of BL, or boy love novels, and anime that have gay male relationships in them. This both targets the small queer culture in Japan, but more importantly, the fujoashi, which is the straight female audience who are the largest consumers of this type of queer media. So on the opposite ends of both spectrums, you have the fetishization of women and gay men. But most oftentimes, this Eastern media, such as manga, anime, and literature, only specifically target one group at a time. This is why we have common Japanese genre types, such as the shonen anime or BL manga. The medium itself restricts the capacity to target multiple groups. However, things differ when you divulge into the medium of games, for you not only have hundreds of hours of content at your disposal, but games' unique feature to stress player control and interpretation allows them to act as a platypus and fit into various types of groupings in marketable genres. For in this conglomerate is born the case we will discuss today, for its struggle to be defined to a singular genre extends into its goal of not just targeting one audience. For at the expense of women and gays everywhere, let's welcome Persona 5 to the floor.
My voice is reaching you. I beg you, please overcome this game and save the world.
Persona 5 is a Japanese role-playing game that released in 2016, published by Atlus. The game takes place in Shibuya, Japan, and follows a group of high schoolers who are able to tap into the cognition of various morally corrupt bad guys in order to change their ways and steal their hearts, as the game puts it. While very distinct in its own campy style, Persona 5 does not exist outside of the realm of common shonen anime tropes, for the overt sexualization of its female characters is plentiful throughout the game's 100-hour-plus campaign.
全部飲んじゃった。後ろは？
This type of scene is not unique to Persona 5, and objectification of this type is used to sell to male audiences. However, we begin to see cracks within the creative process behind the game when we scrutinize the contradictions scenes like this present to the overall moral compass of the story. In the first palace, or dungeon of the game, you work to dethrone an abusive volleyball teacher named Kamoshida, who not only abuses his students but also sexually assaults female students at the school. Everything that the antagonistic Kamoshida does is explicitly stated as being wrong within the narrative, and the game wants you to condemn his action he takes in making women objects. However, even during his palace portion of the game, female characters are still being sexualized in a way that is supposed to appeal to men.
Huh? Why am I dressed like this? When did I... What's with this?
Now, obviously there's some hypocrisy going on here, but where did it come from? Why would a game that promotes a feminist message counteract said message with these provocative scenes? The answer lies within the loss of authorship that exists within games. Persona 5 was a game that spanned a 6-year production period that had a staff of over 70 people working on it in its full production. Games of this scale differ from literature in this sense, for there can be no common author. The work of the collective must be taken for what it is. In Miguel Sigart's essay Against Procedurality, he makes a strong claim against this type of rhetoric that fosters the dominant idea of the designer as the provider of meaning for the game. He goes on to diminish how true authorship in games isn't really possible, as meaning is derived from play itself. Play, the performative, expressive act of engaging with a game, contradicts the very meaning of authorship in games. Players don't need the designer, they need a game, an excuse, and a frame for play. Now, while this argument of ludology versus narratology when it comes to interpretation of a game cannot be perfectly applied to our questioning of feminist critiques, it does raise the problematic way in which one can slip into a proceduralist mindset when discussing games. If we were to treat Persona 5, in this instance, like other types of media with a clear authorship, then the nuance of how clashing ideologies like this could come to fruition in a game would be lost. For we know content of this nature is pushed in order to better service the wider male community the game is appealing to. However, Persona is a unique case in that it doesn't just stop its targeted fan service there. Now that we've concluded that Persona 5 is a game that is both feminist and misogynistic due to the way its narratology and fan service contradict each other, we can now move on to the lesser-known case of how it is both homophobic and queer. While there are a handful of distasteful canon queer characters within the game that pose problems with representation in their own right, I wish to just focus on the pairing of the protagonist with teen detective and antagonist Goro Akechi, for it provides a more nuanced understanding of how Persona both plays into its queer fanbase while mocking them. While Goro Akechi and Ren Amayami, which is the default name of the game's protagonist, do not have a canon love story in the game, the homoerotic nature of their interaction epitomizes them as a textbook definition of a queer-baiting couple. Their actions in swapping clothes, bathing together, and confessions of their admiration for each other all carry homoerotic undertones that Joseph Brennan categorizes in his edited collection of essays, Queer Baiting and Fandom, teasing fans through homoerotic possibilities. Within this introduction, he lays grounds to the history of queerbaiting and how it can arise in media through different forms. While his accounts on situational, unintentional, and necessary homoeroticism are all fascinating in exploring why queerbaiting sometimes needs to exist due to the inability to tell gay stories in a commercial manner or the inherentness of homosociality in shared activities, they do not really fit the case we are dealing with. Akechi and Ren fall best into the category of what he describes to be the gay vague. Brennan describes the gay vague as a recent iteration of gay marketing, a tradition of covert courting and capturing of queer audiences, and followings by queer media professionals. He goes on to borrow Janet L. Borgeson's understanding of the phenomenon that the gay vague texts are composed in a way that target the homosexual consumer but may go unremarked by the straight consumer. This targeting of gay consumers, which molds itself into a form of rainbow capitalism, is a more recent trend that emerged from the general global movement to accept homosexuality. Catherine Sender, in her book Business, Not Politics, The Making of the Gay Market, explores how gay men were specifically being targeted to starting in the 1990s due to their higher-than-average earnings and more freely spent disposable incomes. Thus, the gay vagueness used within the Persona 5 franchise and in other media is a way in which one can see how media can straddle itself between two identities to reap the rewards of both audiences. In doing so, however, the queerness that does exist within the relationship of two men is almost non-existent due to the fact that heteronormative mold is still placed over the characters that allows traditional roles of feminine and masculine partners to play out. This concept is explored in Divya Garg's thought piece, Japanese Popular Culture and Queer Politics, in which canonical gay male love stories in Japan can still lack queerness due to the stress put on the uke-seme binary, which is the submissive and dominant traits, respectively. We see that even though queer characters and relationships are available to us in the main text, their problematic portrayal does nothing to further the cause of actual queerness, Garg states. This further exhibits that queerness is not just defined within the constraints of the text, but also within the dynamic of homosocial relationships. it is evident that the Akechi-Ren pairing, which is the most popular Persona 5 ship on Archives of Our Own with over 1,000 stories, worked to appeal to its targeted audiences. Yet, its execution was done so in a way that would not jeopardize the male audience's fragile masculinity. In the end, Persona 5 is an interesting case study to look at when you try to understand it through the lens of ludocapitalism. So many aspects of the game and its fan service exist to broaden the appeal and maximize the profits from groups that could intentionally buy the game. And before closing, I do want to say there are bound to be faults within my Western perspective on an Eastern game. The way we interpret male and male interaction as homoerotic can be completely lost on the domestic Japanese audience. Still, it does not mean that the notions of Western queerbaiting are not present within this case. Persona 5 is a game that utilizes its male gaze and male gaze in order to create an experience that could appeal to the widest array of people possible. However, in doing so, it muddies its own narrative and moral compass, thus toppling the balance of fetishization and fan service it so carefully tried to create. I do want to make a quick note to take a look at the bibliography page if you want to follow up with even more readings on the topic. There were so many great sources I didn't have time to pull from directly, but were absolutely present through my gained knowledge on the topic and their ideas that helped springboard my own. They're all present and readily available in the following slides.